Hey folks, thanks for joining me for this episode from EmbellishPod, an opportunity for me to ramble about whiskey or something for a few minutes. If you got here by chance, please take a moment to hit the subscribe button. Hopefully, I can be found on any podcasting platform that exists. And if you can't find me on a platform, send me an email at embellishpod@gmail.com. I'll get that taken care of. You can also find video versions of this podcast on YouTube. You can find all of my links on Instagram at EmbellishPod or TikTok with the same handle. I have a website. It is www.embellishpod.com. It's also a place to pick up these links, episode details, and more. Today, I have the incredible honor of having Maureen Robinson join me from Kentucky Owl. And she's got a pretty significant history, and we're going to have a fantastic conversation about her history, about the work that she's done in the past in the Scotch industry, the work that she's going to be doing with Kentucky Owl, and a couple of other fun and interesting things. This morning, this afternoon, this evening, we're welcoming Maureen to the podcast, and it's an incredible honor. She's been part of the success at many brands, not limited to Johnny Walker, Buchanan, Singleton, but more recently, she's come on board the Kentucky Owl team as their new master blender, replacing John Rhea. You had retired from Diageo, but this opportunity from Kentucky Owl seemed like it was enticing enough to bring you out of retirement. Tell me a bit about yourself and how this Kentucky bourbon brand was enough to bring you out of a very, very storied retirement.
Yeah, as you say, my name is Maureen Robinson, and I was in the Scotch whisky industry for 45 years. And actually, for 9 of these years, I actually was in the laboratories basically learning my craft, like aromas and flavors and a bit about the science behind Scotch. And then I moved into blending, and I was a master blender with Diageo for 36 years. And as you say, I retired June last year. But it's one of these things, even my family say, what happened to retirement? Because it only lasted about 6 months. And then I was approached by Kentucky Owl if I'd be interested in doing a collaboration with them as part of the collaboration series. And I'd never worked with bourbon before. So I was really interested to saying that, yeah, I would quite like that because it would give me something else to get into. And also, retirement is okay, but you sometimes get a little bit bored. So I thought, right, okay, I'll do this project for them, and thinking it was only going to be about 6 months, 8 months. And then after working with John on the collaboration, John had then decided he was going to retire. So, and of course, John, that was his second retirement because he actually was with Four Roses for about 40 years. And then Kentucky Owl then pulled him out of retirement to do to become the master blender for Kentucky Owl. But he decided he was retiring again. So what happened was they approached me again and asked if I'd be interested to take on the role for a few years. Since John was retiring, and I said yes, I'd do it for a few years. So that's how I ended up working for Kentucky Owl.
So it seems like John has effectively stolen your retirement, right? Like he's like, hey, come work on this thing, and then he's like, all right, now I've got her. I'm gonna go retire, and she can do that. What is maybe I may be wrong here, but it feels like there's a relatively significant adjustment going from working in Scotch to working in bourbon. And Colin and I were talking about this off air, but you get these camps, or at least I've noticed camps in whiskey. You got your Scotch people and your Irish people and your Japanese people, Japanese whiskey people, and your American whiskey people, and they all maybe drink the other things, but they're really kind of very, very locked into the thing that they do. Was shifting into this like Kentucky bourbon frame difficult? Was it easy? Because there's a few more rules in place for bourbon than there are for Scotch.
Yeah, it's one of these things. I've just come into the role, so there's a lot. I've got a lot of development and learning to, um, regarding bourbon. But there's certain things in bourbon. When I was working the project, I realised that there was some, there wasn't as many differences as what I thought. Okay, the aroma and flavour, that's where the main difference is. But when it comes to the process and also coming into blending, there's a lot of similarities. If you think about it. when you're creating a new bourbon or a new Scotch. In the Scotch side of the business, you've got different distilleries, different ages, different wood types, and you've got something similar in bourbon as well. Because if you think about bourbon, you've got the different mash bills. You know, you can change the mash bill. You've got different ages, and you've got the different. I know it's all new cask you've got to use, but you've got the charring levels of the casks. So you can actually use that different charring levels to sort of create the sort of wood profile you would have got in Scotch. So to me, there is quite a lot of similarities, and that's what I'm really looking forward to really get into bourbon and just build up my knowledge of the, you know, what the different charring levels does to the spirit and the different mash bills. So and that's a bit I'm finding quite exciting, and I think it'll be a great development plan for me just to go into a different type category of whiskey.
Hmm. And I mean, it's interesting because I know, working in Scotch, you've likely had a lot of experience using ex-bourbon casks because that's, it's a pretty popular cask. And so there's some tangential knowledge that exists there. But one of the things that is one of the more glaring differences for me, at least, is, in the Scotch industry, blending is a very revered position, right? Like there is a high degree of notoriety, and it's a thing that's celebrated. But historically, in bourbon, that wasn't necessarily the case. I mean, if we run back into the 70s and 80s, blended whiskey and blended bourbon was not um, very well thought of, at least in the North American marketplace. But it's starting to kind of hit its stride, and I think part of it is due to companies like Kentucky Owl and a handful of other folks that are kind of saying, hey, there's this art to blending that exists, right? There's an art to distilling. There's a science and art to distilling, and then there's a science and art to blending, and those things aren't always the exact same thing. But um, are there some places where you have a distinct knowledge that you think you're going to be able to help shift this within the bourbon industry as well? And I would challenge probably yes, but I'd like to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, yeah. I feel I was actually asked that question one of the times I was over in the US, because the master distiller is the person, you know, and blending was quite new. And my answer to that was that I feel both could work hand in hand because as an industry, bourbon is the same, I think, as Scotch is the consumers always looking for something new. So I feel that as a blender and a distiller, you can work hand in hand because you can actually take the knowledge of the distiller about the different mash bills. What happens if you change the mash bill to this and things like that? What, you know, and then as a blender, you then take that mash bill and put it into the different types of casks, and then just monitor and and that to a certain extent is a wee bit of a sort of long term to a certain extent because you've got to wait at least 2 3 years, 3 years more to get the flavors coming through. But it's something that I feel that we could experiment with as the different mash bills, and just for going forward that you can actually create new brands based on innovation.
And I like this interplay of distiller and blender. And there's a heritage brand out there that has a particular club, and they put out um, two bottles that were blends, and one was done by the master blender and one was done by the master distiller, is sort of like a club only release. And I got to taste them, and lo and behold, the blender's version, at least in my opinion, was significantly better than the distillers. And it's not that the distillers was bad, but when that's your function, right? Your function is to create the best blend. I think maybe you're better suited to do so than the distiller, who is, I need to make the best possible distillate that goes into the barrel and then ages and comes back out the other side of it. But in crafting this particular bottle that you guys worked on together, and I guess we haven't even mentioned it yet, is we have the Maester, and I think I pronounced that one right. I looked it up
Yes,
a
that's
couple of
right. It's
times.
Maester. Yeah.
It's Maester. And I know my brain immediately wants to say Magister, um, because that's the way the American English works, and it's not the greatest. But when you started working on this, the intent, is, at least from what I've read, is to put together a bourbon in a Scotch style. Um, when you started off, did you start off with a flavor profile that you and John were chasing together, or did you just kind of identify your sources and then put the blend together?
Yeah, what it was is we kind of used both our experiences and what we imagine the styles to be. And John, he actually did a lot of work and then passed it on to me. He took based on his experience of what Scotch was like. You know what he he reminisced of what Scotch was like, and he actually pulled in lots of samples, and then he passed them on to me. And basically, we probably did both do it sort of separate, because John had come up with some recipes that he thought that was close to what they wanted. He then passed them on to me, and I then took the samples, and then I sort of made them up, and then I sort of, I nosed the individual components and things like that, and then I did some tweaking as to what I thought, because bourbon is quite a strong flavour, it's quite strong. Is it? I was trying to get across in the Scotch element more like the lighter Scotches, not like in Scotland in the Scotch you've got like this very smoky whiskies and things like that, which we couldn't do at bourbon anyway. But I was trying to get a lot of the lighter styles in, and what I found was there was certain samples where the sort of lighter style, sort of citrus fruits, the fresh fruits of a Scotch. And so I sort of played around with them to get a bit more what I thought was more reminiscent of what a Scotch was, but still without losing the credentials of being a bourbon, because this is 100% bourbon, so you don't want to lose its identity. And so I then passed on what I got to John, and then he sort of made them up, because we both had our own sets of samples, and he made it up as well. And then we came to agreement that the one that we put in the bottle, Maester, was what we thought was a good example of the collaboration between a bourbon and a Scotch.
So, and this is maybe a little bit more of what your personal style is as you're putting your blends together. Are you doing this as close to the bottling strength as you're going to get, or do you make the blend and proof them down at various proofs to kind of taste through it? Like, what is that process like?
What usually happens, and the same thing happened when we were doing the collaboration series, is you tend to try and find what's I won't say ideal strength, but a strength that allows the aroma and flavour to come out what you're looking for. But where the collaboration series was, we were sort of looking at they decided earlier on we wanted a strength, the same strength for all three in the series. And one of the reasons behind that was because when if you're doing a sort of comparison, you didn't want to have in the back of your head, oh, this is at such and such a strength, this is at that. What we were trying to get across was that the strengths were all the same. So what you were comparing was the different styles of whiskey between the three of them. And that was one of the reasons why we came. And also at 100, they're all at 100 proof. Is that they weren't, when you're tasting them, they weren't too strong. You weren't getting a lot of the harshness of alcohol and things like that. So you're getting it was quite a nice smooth strength, but it was also allowing the aroma, giving you lots of aroma and flavour coming through at that strength.
Yeah, and I like that. That's useful because as you taste other brands that will do some of these experimental series whenever they're at different cask strengths, it's really you nailed it. It's difficult to do that comparison, and it also kind of adds a collectability. Like, now I can taste all the three of these things together. But for this Maester edition specifically, right, we're paying homage to Scotch. Does it hold up to proofing down? Like, if I take it down to a 90 or 100 or 90 or an 80 from the 100 that it's at, would I expect it to stay the same, or because I'm thinking about the traditionalists for Scotch. 100 proof is on the high end for a lot of Scotch drinkers. If they proof it down, then what?
Yeah, and also I do. What I found was with Maester is that adding a touch of water actually does what I term as my flavour journey, because basically you're adding a touch of water and it changed it slightly, but you still got what I found was that in the aroma. If you nose it straight at 100 and then you add a touch of water, you find the aroma doesn't change much. It maybe brought out the emphasis on the bourbon style, the bourbon aromas coming through. But what I found was in the taste and the flavour was that when you add the water, initially when you actually tasted the whiskey at 100, you get all the bourbon flavours coming through first. Then you got the Scotch flavours coming afterwards. But when you added a touch of water, it kind of flipped. You end up getting all the Scotch flavours coming first and then the bourbon flavours. And so I find it quite, it was really quite interesting that, just adding that touch of water, actually, it can emphasize different things in different whiskies. I'm a person who I like adding ice to a lot of stuff, especially
Hmm.
using ice balls, not, the hard ice balls, because to me, that is almost like a flavor journey to me. If you're sitting a drink with an ice ball, and sometimes I just add a touch of water to, because what happens is that water heats the whiskey up, and then that starts to melt the ice ball, but it's very slowly. And so as you're sipping and tasting, every time you go back to it, you're getting another flavour coming through and things like that. So it's something that I've done this for years. I just call it my flavour journey,
Hmm.
because you can sit and enjoy it. And the good thing about an ice ball is, by the time you've actually got, you might have finished your drink, and then you still got plenty of ice left, so you might have another one just to sort of give you another
Absolutely.
flavour journey.
Yeah, I agree with that completely. So for the Maester specifically, you mentioned a little bit about the flavors, but what is the flavor journey, that you've sort of kind of documented yourself from this? Because, and I know, like, taste is subjective and everybody's going to taste
Yeah.
something slightly different. But what is the journey for you, like, on this bottle?
Yeah, and this one with Maester, what I found is that when you first nose it, you'd actually think you were nosing a Scotch, because you get the sort of, to me, like the green floral notes coming through. One of my descriptors is hedgerows, but I think that's quite difficult for an American to understand, because we get hedgerows in Scotland, but you don't get. I very much doubt you get them in America. So you get that first, then you start to get like ester, citrus fruits, estery fruits, and then all of a sudden you get a sort of sweetness, and that fruitiness turns into like stewed fruits.
Hmm.
You get like, if you're making an apple pie or something like that, you've got the sort of sweetness of stewed fruits. Then after a time, you then start to get the bourbon flavors aroma start coming through. So you start to get the spicy oakiness. We're getting a bourbon. Then you get the sort of, what items, the vanilla fudge flavors coming, aromas coming through. And then you get that sort of, I tend to call it black currants. It's a hint of black currants. It's almost like dark fruits.
Hmm.
It's something. It's a descriptor I've always used for bourbon, is black currants, and so you get that hint of black currants come through. And as I mentioned earlier on, and then in the flavour, you get all the bourbon flavours come through first. You get the spicy oak, you get the vanilla fudge, you get the sort of black currants, but it's also quite creamy on the roof of the mouth, and it's very smooth going down. It's not, it's not, you don't get a burn. It's very smooth going down, and then after a while, it then becomes, you get this nice spicy oak aftertaste in the mouth. But it's not overpowering. It's nice and subtle, and it leaves a lovely aftertaste.
Absolutely, and you described a fantastic journey, right? Like, so that I like that, and I think that's how most people, whether they can communicate it well or not, that's what they anybody who drinks whiskey neat or with ice or any fashion, they sort of have that inherently. It's just kind of part of it, because you get acclimated to a certain flavor and then you go back and taste, and now you pick up a different flavor. And I always enjoy listening to people from other parts of the world describe whiskey, because you mentioned blackcurrant, but blackcurrant's not something that largely exists in North America, aside from a jelly or something. And that doesn't give you the taste of a blackberry jelly and a blackberry are very, very different from each other. They're reminiscent of each other, but they're not the same. And so, trying to find what the thing is that we have that's similar to that is always um, super fun. So, for the Maester, if I want to go on this journey, is this do I need to put this in a glass and let it sit for 10 minutes? Like, how should I taste this if I want to taste it like Maureen does?
I think, as I said before, you have it in the glass to begin with, nose and taste it. Try it neat first, but then I would try. The other thing I always say to people is, you drink whether it's a bourbon, an American whiskey, or a Scotch. So you drink it the way you like it. The way you enjoy it. You should. We tend to sort of say, you should drink it like this and that, but we're there to give you guidance as to how to drink it. But I always say to people, experiment your different serves, because you might find one it's completely different you enjoy better than what you'd expect to. And so to me, start with it's neat, try and taste it, add a little water, but then and see all the differences when you add the water, but then go and try it with the ice, and
Hmm.
as you go along.
And that's sort of the progression. At least a lot of my friends that will do tasting notes, they do neat ice or neat water ice as their progression, so they can kind of see how it
Yeah,
transforms.
yeah.
It's always kind of an interesting journey for folks. Um, So you're now the master blender for Kentucky Owl, and Kentucky Owl has put out the Takumi, which was Japanese whiskey inspired. There was an Irish whiskey, the St. Patrick's Day edition. There is now the Maester, and we're exploring what it appears like we're exploring world whiskeys. What does the future hold, or can we speak to what the future holds for this?
I think the idea is that there will be more collaborations, but we're going to put that on hold for a wee while because basically I had three right non-stop after one another. So we've decided that we will be doing more collaborations, but we're going to sort of maybe sort of park it for a wee while and start looking at other things that we can do because Kentucky, what we want to do is we want to expand the portfolio. So
Hmm.
it's a matter of looking at what can we do, what do you want to do in the future. And one of the other things I think Kentucky wants to do as well is that we actually want to make it global. You know,
Hmm.
we want to go out with it is already the collaborations are out with the US, but bourbon's not really still that popular out with the US. So I
Hmm.
think one of the things we want to do is to start to bring get things, you know, go round the world with it to let people understand that you do have the bourbons, okay, things like Jack Daniels, Jim Beam, they're very well known globally, but what we want to do is to show that there is other flavours and aromas out there. There is a diversity of flavour within bourbon. So we want to enhance that and take it to the world rather than just keep it within the US.
So you're talking about expanding the portfolio right now. Kentucky Owl traditionally does. They do a bourbon, they do a rye under the flagship Kentucky Owl, which is this storied brand that's been around forever. And then we have Wiseman, Wise Man or Wise Man, I can't remember which one it is.
Wiseman.
Wiseman. So Wiseman is another one. Are we talking about kind of expanding underneath those, or is there going to be maybe some new SKUs, for lack of a better term, that come in
I
as
think
part of this?
I think where Wiseman's concerned is we'll probably keep that as it is just now. Maybe look at doing different things, but I think our concentration will be on Kentucky Owl. Seeing what can we do to create new innovations within Kentucky Owl, and probably look at things that are maybe going to be like ongoing, not just limited edition, but looking can we do something that's going to be mainstream.
Hmm.
So that's something for us to look at.
And maybe this is a discussion, maybe it's not. At least in the United States, American single malt is this rising category, at least with some impending legislation to clearly identify what it is. Is there opportunity with your background and with the rising growth of this particular segment that Kentucky Owl explores American single malts?
Yeah, there always is opportunity, no matter what it is. I'm not that because I'm not that long in role. I've still got to do a lot of discussions with our market and people and things like that. So it's something, it's something that's there to explore. I'm not saying we won't do it or we will do it. It's just it's there to be explored and something for the future.
Hmm. And then maybe one final on market trends, but like barrel finishing is super popular in the United States now with the different wine finishes that exist. There's some tequila finishes out there, and sometimes it can feel a little bit cliche or overused, and then sometimes it's really it feels very innovative. We have somebody that's like, oh, I'm finishing it in a watermelon Jolly Rancher barrel. Like that's not a real thing, but when you find these new spirits to kind of pair with, or new barrel types to pair with. Is that a thing that Kentucky Owl looks to explore, or are we sticking with very traditional bourbon
No,
profile?
I think we will explore it because we've already done it with Kentucky. We had the Mardi Gras
Hmm.
product, so it's something to explore. The thing with finishing, you've got to be very careful. the type of cask you choose, and also what you put into the cask, because you want to get them both to marry together. You don't want where one overpowers the other. So it's all about getting a marriage and just them just gelling right. So
Hmm.
that's something sometimes it takes quite a bit of time. Plus that with finishing, you've also got to, and we used to do something similar in Scotch, because basically with a finishing you could start finishing something, but by the time you get to the end of it you think that's not what I wanted. So you've got to move, it takes a wee while for to get it right.
Hmm.
So but it's again like expand portfolio and finishing single cast, it's all there to explore, and something that we will be willing to explore.
So, and you mentioned a word in there, single cask. Like the ability to for a particular retailer group, whatever, to do single casks is that a place that Kentucky Owl looks to expand into in the future?
That's I'm not too sure,
Hmm.
but as I said earlier on, there's it's a bit like in Scotch. So, you've got the world's an oyster, if you want to say,
Hmm.
to try different things. And um, I quite like doing experimental stuff. So, it's just something. It's there to look at.
And so, in your current position, part of the goal is to help craft the direction of the Kentucky Owl brand and kind of see where it's going to go. In your experience in the Scotch realm, was it similar to that, or do those brands have such a history that you're sort of like, here's your core profile, you need to stay as close to this as possible, and you have one experiment here, one experiment there?
Yeah. It depends, because let's say if you take let's say Kentucky Ale confiscated, that's like part of
Yep.
our core brand got just now. So part of the remit for let's say a blender also is to make sure the consistency of that brand stays as close as possible as what you want to do. But it's the same with no matter what you do. But let's say if when it comes to you're talking about Scotch here. If you take the Singleton brand as an example, the Singleton brand was it was one of these where it was new. We introduced it, and the different ones for different markets, and
Hmm.
that was new. It was just somebody came up with an idea. Okay, some of the distilleries weren't new, but the actual the story behind it was completely new from what it was before. So,
Hmm.
the same thing. I can see the same thing happen with Kentucky. There'll be something there that we want to build from, from the bottom upwards to get it into something that's worldwide known.
Was there something that was particular about Kentucky Owl that was attractive to pull you out of retirement? Or was it just the bourbon segment itself plus the history of Kentucky Owl? Like, was
I,
it was
I,
it
I
both of
think
those
it
things or one or
was
the other?
I think it was the segment,
Hmm.
because I'd never worked in that segment before. But also Kentucky Owl had, to me, what I found interesting was the original founder, Charles Dedman. He was a pharmacist, and to a sense, and I actually started my career trained to be a pharmacist. I actually took a sort of almost like a sabbatical out. I never went back to doing pharmacy. I ended up going down the sort of chemistry route instead, and I started working for Diageo. Uh, and the thing about the sort of pharmacy side is that just recently I've had a bit of a whirlwind since I actually retired, because just about 2 or 3 weeks ago I actually got an honorary doctorate from the university I actually went to in Glasgow. So that's so I kind of sort of think, oh, this is good. I've,
Hmm.
I never actually completed my course, but I've now got a doctorate in science. So it's really, it's just what it was. One of these things where, again, as I say, I had never worked with a bourbon before. I hadn't actually done a lot of tasting of bourbon either, and I think it's because occasionally some of the, it was never something on my radar before.
Hmm.
And now it's really, I've actually got to quite really get into it now. So it's interesting because I now do have bourbons as well as Scotch in the house. So
Hmm. Well, there's all kinds of ways for us to spread the market. Maybe it's just start hiring everybody from from Scotland to work for us. And you mentioned on this, and it was actually a question I did have, because my mother was a pharmacist for the duration of her career, and as I started poking around about who Maureen was, I come across this thing. It says, you studied to become a pharmacist. So pharmacy can be a very interesting career. There's a lot of science that's involved in that. How do you make this transition from where you're studying to become a pharmacist, and then you're like, I'm gonna go work in whiskey? Like, how does that transition happen?
As I say, it was one of these things where I actually had been at university. I actually took the year out. Then within that time, I thought, right, I'm going to start seeing if I could get a job. And I actually applied for well, I didn't actually. It was one of these things where I was lucky, where I wrote into it was DCL at that time. I wrote into asking if there was any jobs in the science in the laboratories. At that time, I got told there was no vacancies, but next thing I got a letter saying there was a vacancy. So I went and I got the job, and it was one of these things. If I hadn't enjoyed what I was doing, I probably would have left and probably went back to university to finish my degree. But I decided that what I was doing in the labs, I was really enjoying it and trying to understand the science of the whiskey. I was starting to learn all about aromas and flavors. And then after 9 years, I kind of sort of went onto a small project, a bit like a blending project, really, as a project, and I really started to enjoy that. And then the opportunity came up to come to get a blender's job and master blend, so I applied for that, and it was one of these things that uh, I didn't think I would get a job because
Mhm.
basically in these days it was DCL. It was still a very male dominated in that part. And that part of the business was still very male dominated. I was a female. I was actually quite young still compared to I did get the job. So and I just went on from there. And I must admit, ever since I became a blender master blender, I had never had enough hours in the day to do what I wanted work wise.
Right. And I think it's still largely the case that, whether it be blender or distiller, those are very, very, male dominated industries. And it's sort of curious because, at least biologically, women tend to be better at tasting things than men are, right?
Yeah.
Whether it's
Well,
evolutionarily or whatever.
yeah, so I don't always sort of agree with that question nowadays. I would have
Mhm.
said years ago, yes, because there's so many, uh, men in even in the household as well as chefs and that. Because a lot of men now do a lot of cooking in the house and the
Mhm.
kitchen and things like that. So I think their vocabulary, I think, is getting a lot better than what it used to be. Uh, and also on the sort of female side, on the blender sides of things, that there is a lot more people within the Scotch industry, females in the Scotch industry, not just in
Mhm.
blending in every aspect, because you've got people who do warehousing, coopering, and things like that. So it for an industry has done a bit of a turn over the
Mhm.
years.
Yeah, and I think, at least here in the United States, I think we're on the edge of making that similar turn. We like to do things on our own timeline, and that's not
Mhm.
always the best. So you're at this kind of pivot point when you were working in a lab and you apply to be a blender. But I would assume, kind of given your pharmacology background and experience in a lab, like, you could make a pivot into a distiller's realm. Was it just the blender job was open, or the blender job is what you really wanted to go after?
It was a bit of both because I'd
Mhm.
actually started doing one of the reasons was I'd already done that project in blending. It was like blending a sort of it was basically it was all based on aroma and flavor. I was helping create a blend with somebody else on it was a blend based on uh it was actually called grassy green. It's all about we were looking for casks that had aromas and flavors of grass and sort of grassy green notes and things like that. So that I had that experience, and then when it came up, I thought, right, I think it is a route I would like to go down. So I applied.
So, and you said grassy flavors, and traditionally, at least from a lot of bourbon drinkers, that becomes a profile that they're not necessarily super fans of. And bourbon is very, at least opinionistically here. Bourbon is, very syrupy sweet, very very sickly sweet. Is that an adjustment point for you coming from Scotch, which can be sweet, but it also has a lot more subtle flavors and a lot more softness to it? Does this like over sweetness, is that like a huge adjustment, or is it not as bad as I would imagine it?
It's not as bad. It's really just getting the balance right between the different. And I think from the with your chine, because what I found when I was doing Maester was that Maester's made up from three straight bourbons and one wheat bourbon, and the wheat bourbon was a 4 year old, and
Mhm.
basically what I found with the wheat bourbon was that it gave you a lot of the characteristics you would expect in a Scotch. You got the sort of citrus fruits, the lightness, and things like that. So it wasn't quite, and the sweetness wasn't what I would tell as a vanilla fudge sweetness. It was just a hint of sweet coming from the sort of stewed fruits type thing. I think it was. You do vanilla sweets. I quite like vanilla fudge,
Mhm.
so I get that a lot in bourbons. It's probably where the balance is. You really have to get the balance right. If let's even in Maester as well as getting, it's actually the oakiness because you tend to have if you've got a level 4 char, that's where you get the right, it's really strong, spicy, oaky, woody. Whereas the sort of lighter char gives you more room for the sort of lighter styles to come through.
Mhm.
And it's a matter of working out what you want in your head as a flavour, and you just play around with the different charring and the different mash bills to try and get what you want.
Okay. And you've touched on this a little bit, but I want to go back to this. You worked on this blend for the Maester with John. He has a huge history with Four Roses, and since his um, first retirement and coming back out to work at Kentucky Owl, and maybe that's what Kentucky Owl's legacy is now, is they just bring everybody out of
Yeah,
retirement,
but
right? Who is the next retired blender that needs to be brought in? But he kind of pushes out this Takumi release and a couple of other things, and he brings you in to work on this. Um, what what about this? How did this blending process work between the two of you? And I know you said kind of there's some samples going back and forth, but is how does this work logistically? I guess.
well, logistically, it worked very well actually because he did all the drawing of the samples and did nosed a lot of the samples, and then he kind of sort of and then pulled out the samples that he thought was right. He sort of sent like component parts to me as well, and I sort of nosed and tasted them, and from them I kind of sort of decided, well, this is more like a Scotch, this is more like a bourbon, and things like that. And that's what I ended up. You played around with, the different component parts, and they were all different ages. As I said before, you had the straight bourbons, and you had in different ages, and then you had the wheat bourbon at another age. So it was a matter because the thing I don't know what you know, but the name Maester is actually Gaelic for master.
Hmm.
And that was one of the reasons why, and it's the same with Takumi, it was the word meant master in Japanese. So that was one of the reasons why the names were picked, because basically what they were trying to do is create a name that sort of defined John and I as that we were masters of our art type thing.
Hmm.
So that's the reason behind the actual names. But then again, we had samples all over the place, and sort of playing around with them and things like that. So, um, and and then we even did it. I was saying that they were at 100 proof, and even for the final one, basically what we did was we made up our blends based on the cash strength first, then diluted it down to 100 proof, and then left it rest and it was kind of done exactly you would do in the process. Where the samples were then allowed to rest for a while, and then we nose and tasted them, and then left them again just to sort of nose and taste to make sure that after a couple of days, even to make sure that they hadn't changed. They were what we were expecting them to do. And again, sometimes for when it comes to, it's a lot of when we're adding water, and that's one of the reasons why we also added water when we're actually nosing and tasting them, is because you want to make sure that when you've added the water, like a consumer might do, that there's nothing going to be, there's not going to be a surprise there. It's going to be what
Hmm.
you expect it to be. So
Yeah, and so maybe couple more questions. The proofing process. Do you just dump your water in and let it go, or did you kind of explore like a slow proof? And then once you do proof it down, how long are you letting it sit
Yeah,
before you kind
yeah,
of revisit it?
we tended to just add the water and then let it sit.
Hmm. And
And
what's is this like you wait a day, you wait a week, you wait a month?
it's
What's
just
the
really a day,
okay?
just 24 hours a day.
Okay. Perfect. So if I do an experiment later on, I say, all right, I'm going to take this Kentucky Island, I'm going to measure things out, and I'm going to get the Maester at 100 proof, 90 proof, 80 proof.
Mm.
A couple hours is all I really
Yeah,
need. I don't have to let it
yeah,
sit for a week or anything like that, because it seems
no.
like a fun thing that I really want to try.
It's,
And I'm going to be like, hey, how does this work out as it proofs down on its own? Um,
The only other thing to add that I didn't do at the beginning about myself is that, and you probably have the information anyway, is that I actually am a keeper of the Quaich, a master of the Quaich, which is the sort of society where you have to be invited to become part of that
mhm,
society. You've got to have done something with the industry. And then I also became, that was in 2012, I became a keeper. In 2022, I actually became a master. And the master one, you have to have been a keeper for 10 years before you can become a master. And again, you have to be invited. It's not guaranteed that you will actually become a master. And I actually was invited to become a master actually after I retired. So it was October last year. And I also, in 2019, I became part of the Whisky Hall of Fame as well.
mhm.
Mm.
So it is maybe, and that kind of brings me a couple more questions now. So, and I'm glad you said the word, because I can read the word, but I don't know how to pronounce it. The Quaith, right? So you're
Quick,
the master of the Quaith and the
quick.
keeper of it. And then in 2019, you're inducted into the Whiskey Hall of Fame.
Whisky Hall of Fame.
Um, I think you may be able to make a run at the Bourbon Hall of Fame as well now, right? So you kind of get into the segment and see how many accolades you can get. Um, and you've said a couple times that this is not and maybe you have a time frame in mind, but I don't know that you expect to do this for 20 more years. Do you have a time frame, or do you have a goal that you're trying
Uh,
to kind of
I,
get to in
I,
this?
no, I don't. I don't have a time frame and probably not a goal. It's probably one of these things where, because the idea is also, we want to progress, so we will bring somebody else in for me to train and things like that, and then as a master blend, I'll just make up mind whether you know when I think it's a time to go type thing. But I don't think it'll be another 45 years. like like I did with the Scotch industry, but I
Mhm.
can't say I can it'll be at least a couple of years probably at least, and then sort of look to the future. And unless I can get a prodigy to come in and actually they can follow my footsteps right away, so quick thing. So it's a matter. And the thing is, to get somebody in, you want to get the right person doing the job and things like that, and that will take that will take time.
So are you actively looking for a successor, or is it just as you work and kind of meet with people and identify folks? Is it going to happen organically?
Yeah, no, it will be the latter. Just as you start to get to
Mhm,
know people and understand the business, and then
mhm.
and just see who just start to look at the people that you meet on a day to day basis.
And so what do you, I guess, do you have anything you're specifically looking for, or you just, you'll get there?
I think it's just one of these things. We'll get there.
Mhm,
You sort of. I suppose the one I was at actually when I was in US in September. There, I was at one of these Whiskey X events, and one of the people there said, "He goes, how'd you get a job in this place to do this type thing?" So there is probably people out there who are enthusiastic, want to do it.
mhm,
But again, it's good to have. I am a blender. I'm not a distiller. But and I sort of, but you need the understanding about distilling in order to become the blender. So it'll be a matter of
mhm.
that. You've got different areas you can look at to where the people could come from. It could be a distiller becomes a blender, or it could be somebody who's in again like what I was in a different industry, a different type of spirit who might look to come into the bourbon industry like what I've done.
Yeah, and it's always interesting to see the people that end up in the bourbon industry, because it can be anything from your story to a history major to a former tech giant, right? They have all these tech people that show up here and artists, and it's just this weird realm of, and I don't think misfit's the right term, but it's just a group of people who become passionate about a thing, and
Yeah.
they sort of explore that, and it feels like that's kind of been your career as well, and it's a pretty significant achievement that you did before you retired, and now you're coming back in to kind of set another round of achievements. And I think we can only expect great things to come out of Kentucky Owl and the things that you're working on. I know us as the whiskey geeks, right? And we don't make up the largest portion of the population of whiskey consumers, right? The whiskey geeks are maybe 2, 3, 4% of the overall marketplace, and there's everybody else is like, that's a pretty bottle, I'm going to buy it. How do you get their attention with Kentucky Owl, right? The people who are, they don't listen to whiskey podcasts or read whiskey news, right? How do we get their attention?
I think it's one of these things is, you can have, okay, we're talking about the pack, they're saying it's a nice bottle, but the thing is, the nice bottle looking pack is only the start of it, because you have to have a good whiskey in the bottle, because otherwise you just won't get anybody coming back to drink it. So a lot of people think a lot of things are, oh, it's the pack, it sells it and things like that, but it's not, because if you've not got something there that it can, the people keep on going back to, because it's good, they enjoy it and things like that. So, and that's the whole point of, for even from the distiller's point of view as well, to make sure they're consistent what they're giving you as a blender to put in the bottle, is that you want the consistency, and just make sure everything in the bottle is there. The other thing, it's also, you do actually have to have a story behind it. You can't just sort of say, here's the bottle, drink it, and that's it. So you do like to have a bit of a story behind it, a sort of history and story behind the bottle as well. Even behind the pack, sometimes, and they do it a lot in the Scotch whisky industry. They do, where it's the actual pack. Because if you take, so maybe taking an old-fashioned type bottle and then using that, and because and then sort of building the story behind what the pack was, and then building the story behind the spirit as well.
Yeah, and it reminds me of a conversation that was had at the Kentucky Bourbon Festival this year, where one of the panelists kind of said, you don't really, and I'm paraphrasing, this is not exactly what he said, but you don't build a brand off of bottles, you build it off of case sales, right? And so you can sell the first bottle, but can you get them to come back and pick up a second one? And that's through that work of consistency and quality. How do you, in a realm where aging in Kentucky and the variation of barrel to barrel can be pretty significant, how do you work to maintain consistency across, specifically if you think about the confiscated or Wiseman, those are supposed to have standard profiles. How do you work to maintain that?
Basically, it's just bringing in lots of samples, and I'm not saying you will, because they did the same as, you'll nose and taste every cask, but what you do is you bring the samples in, and you will mix the samples up to what you want the blend to be like, and then you nose and taste that, and then if it's not consistent with what you want, you then have to go back and pull it apart again and play, and do the cast. So it's basically is doing a lot of sampling, because I know, within bourbon, which we didn't have the issue in Scotland, but is the temperature, and it is getting that right balance where the casts are lying and things like that. So it's making sure that you are consistent the way you draw the samples.
Yeah. And do you keep like a control sample handy where it's like, this is what the profile of it is, right? I pulled this out of a bottle and now I start looking towards that.
Yeah, there will be, and also it's the same with it's like the new distillate coming off as well. You'll have a sample of that and checking the new distillate as it comes off to make sure
Okay.
that's the same.
And as a blender, how much time do you spend with new distillate, or do you spend any time with new
Well,
distillate as it comes off?
what it will be is, I know I'm based in Scotland, but my idea is when I want to do all the nosing and tastings, I will head over to Bardstown to Kentucky Owl, and I arrange for to bring all the samples in. And the distillate plays an important part of the blending process as well, and that's one of the things I've got. It's the other thing for a sort of blend, sort of development plan for me is actually having a new distillate, because we'll have the new distillate, this new distillate line in the tomato is actually looking at maybe 2 years on, or 1 year, 2 year, just to see how the cash reacts, and that starts building up my knowledge of the, the flavors and the aromas in the as it's maturing in the cask. And then that actually helps you a lot more when it comes to the actual making up batches, because you know your own mind. Well, if this is this age in this barrel, I know it looks like that and things like that. So especially when it comes to innovation.
Yeah. And so you're doing kind of an initial taste at 1 to 2 years. Do you what does your sampling frequency look like for, what's in the barrel once it gets into a mature age? And by mature, I'm really just kind of saying post 4 years, right? Is it
Yeah.
every 6 months? Is it once a year? Or
Initially, for me, it will be, as I say, because I'm just learning
mhm,
about bourbon and things like that. Is actually I'll do it on maybe every 6 months or something like that. But
mhm,
once I've got that knowledge, it'll be I'll bring in just when I'm making up batches. I'll bring it in and then I'll play it. And then if it's not what I want, I then go back and see. Well, there could be a rogue cask there, so you've got to pull that rogue cask out and things like that, and just to
mhm.
make sure you're consistent. And
All right. Yeah,
it's like anything else. You might have to add some cask when you make a batch up, because sometimes uh, you, you tend to you can build into what you think is going to be in the barrel and things like that, but at the end
mhm,
it might be slightly different. So when you make that batch up, so you've got uh, what you've got to do then is you've got to try and realise what was it I'm missing, some of that, and then add in another few casks of what you think you need to add to
mhm.
bring up to that consistency.
So what I assume, you have just like a significant number of samples. What do you do with all these samples? Because I assume you don't drink all of them, right? You
No,
may
don't drink
taste out of
small.
them.
Well,
So
I
then
was
what
going to say,
happens to them? Like,
yeah, I'm not, I'm assuming it's the same as in Scotch. You actually put them down the sink.
mhm.
You actually just pour them down.
Yeah, and there's,
Because it's, I
I
mean,
would
the same,
assume it's the exact same thing. Yeah.
yeah. Because basically, because you're drawing the samples, you're drawing them in as what term is what we term as duty free. So they're not, you can't do anything with them unless you're going to pay the duty, American duty, and then you just put them down the sink.
Yeah. Do you ever come across one sample where you're like, no, no, I'm going to set this over to the side and I'm going to drink the
It,
rest of
that
this
can
later on
happen.
because it's fantastic.
That can happen, because sometimes you might find when you're doing that, you might find an individual cask that you might like, and you
Mhm,
put that aside. And that's probably going back to the question, when it comes to single cask. Is that the kind of thing you would do with a single? If you're going to go down in the future, if you go down that route, it could be you come across one of that, you thought, oh, I'm going to leave that one, and that'll be
mhm. Yeah, and I know at least in the United States, a lot of people go kind of crazy over the idea of single casks, but I know they're also just incredibly expensive to do because you're having to kind of stop and on a production line, you have to stop, you have to clean your lines, then you have to put in, and this is what you get, and maybe you're left with a small bottle, and then you stop, and they got to have a special label, and everybody feels great about it. It makes more sense, at least to me, whenever you like have an event, like we're gonna have a release for this event, right? Instead of having every club group and retailer come to you and say, well, I should get a barrel as well, right? But we all want it, right? Because we want to
yeah,
taste a single barrel version of this particular distillate because it gives you an idea of what goes into your blends, right? Because the blends are great. Um, I don't have any more questions, and I really really appreciate the time that you have given me. And I'm excited to see what you specifically are going to do with Kentucky Owl, and I'm enjoying this sort of residency of what have been significant masters of their craft over the last handful of years within the Kentucky Owl brand. All right. So thank you very much for joining me once again, Maureen. If there's anything else that you want to share, if you have a link or social media or any of that stuff that you have to do now, feel free to share that. But like I said, I truly appreciate the time.
yeah. Thank you. It's been a pleasure speaking to you. And I'm one of the old school. I don't really do social media a bit.
Yeah. It's, it can be that's the one thing that is the worst about some of this stuff is having to try to keep up with that. I'm old enough to have been before the internet existed, but I grew up with it as a, kind of a teenager. And so I still have some of that grumbliness when it comes to social media. So I appreciate that completely. Thanks for tuning in for this offering from EmbellishPod. If you enjoyed this, please leave me a review on whatever platform that you have to be consuming this on, and leave a comment if possible. Hit me up on social media at TikTok or Instagram using EmbellishPod, and give me a follow so you can keep up with what's going on here. I can be found at www.embellishpod.com with all of my links, accounts, and contact details. Thanks for stopping by.